Good evening to all of you, dear participants. Welcome to lecture number 6 of our 14-day lecture series, titled Lecture Across the Ages, Literary Schools and Movements. Today we have a young and erudite scholar with us, Dr. Bhawna Vij Arora, who is an assistant professor at Vivekananda Institute of Professional Studies, Pitampura, Delhi, which is affiliated to Guru Gobind Singh Indraprastha University, Dwarka, New Delhi. Her research foregrounds gender studies and women's writing, modern European drama, Indian women's poetry, cinema of resistance. In the past, she had been the recipient of the Fulbright Scholarship to Yale University in the year 2015-16 as language teaching assistant. She has also received Indraprastha Research Fellowship under University School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Guru Gobind Singh University, Indraprastha University in the year 2013 and 14. Her teaching experience include in teaching in some of the reputed colleges such as Bharati College, which is affiliated under University of Delhi, Northern Indian Engineering College, Netaji Subhash University of Technology, and Delhi Technical University as guest capacities. She has presented her articles and papers in the conferences held by Delhi University, Mumbai University, Punjab University, Central University of Kerala, Old Dominion University, Virginia State University, United States, to name a few. As a committed academician, her articles have been published in well-known journals and academic periodicals. In the past, she has also made a documentary project under the aegis of Digital Media Center of Arts, DMCA, Yale University in the year 2015-16. So on behalf of Team DAATH Voyage, Dr. Bhawna, it's an absolute honor and a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Without wasting much time, we are eagerly waiting for your lecture. The platform is all yours.
Thank you so much for having me. A very good evening to all the participants and scholars, my fellow faculty members from all across India, Pan-India. This is a great initiative, and I would once again congratulate Dr. Banerjee for this Pan-India ability to bring these scholars together, scholars, faculties, and professors together. It's a great initiative, and probably each one of us are we can always put up our congratulatory messages to Professor Banerjee for such a brilliant initiative of bringing this academic camaraderie together. So today's lecture is about the Victorian age too, and the literary trends that we are going to discuss today would be realism, naturalism, magic realism, and decadent movement. And before I begin formally with literary realism, I hope you all understand that these literary movements, that is the subject matter of today's discussion, these all movements are cross-cultural, they are intergenerational, they are expanding over a number of continents and countries in Europe, and they're often quite crossing and transcending these national boundaries. So it's very difficult to pigeonhole and culturally appropriate each one of them as to belonging to a particular region, country, continent only, because literature is something, it is across different countries, and it just moves ahead, moves beyond the limitations of different epochs and different soils. So, of course, these different movements that we are going to take into account today, realism, naturalism, magic realism, and decadent movement, they certainly took a lot of its own local coloration, but by and large, the literary connoisseurs, the literati of the entire of the Europe, they formed an international cultural camaraderie when it came to the literary or its artistic depictions as far as these trends were concerned. So realism, the nature and plausibility of realism, if we take into account in ethics, in aesthetics, in philosophy, in science, in mathematics, and so forth, as you can read on the screen. And these, of course, just a preemptive apology I would make. I'm not very much a PPT kind of a person. I believe that a discourse should be allowed to run freely and smoothly. The stream of words should come out very freely. But anyways, these PPTs, the content material on this is being very selective. So what you read holds certainly much importance. So realism as a school of thought, as a philosophy, it originated differently in the 18th century in different modalities of the subject matter, in semantics, mathematics, everyday world of macroscopic material objects, their properties. But because we're concerned with literature and arts precisely, so we'll limit our discourse and delimit it only to literary canons, the material texts, the literary periodizations with respect to literary realism. So realism was first introduced to the names of the works of Gustav Courbet and a group of other fellow painters. So historically, realist movement, it especially started off in painting, and it had its origin in the 19th century France, especially after the 1848 revolutions. And it was first introduced by Gustav Courbet and his group of people, group of fellow painters. And these include, as you can read on our screens, Jean-Francois Millet, Breton, then Jean-Baptiste Camille, all of them who squarely rejected the idealization of both the subject matter and technique of pictorial representation, wherein anything more aesthetic, anything romantic, away from the everyday life was depicted. So these artists, in a way, rejected the idealization in pictorial representation, and they embraced the very idea of everyday life experienced by the working class, experienced by the people on margins, experienced by the proletariat, people on usually who do not form the center of a particular society, the bourgeois or the upper classes, the elite, the royalty, the monarchs, and so forth. So in order to get an understanding of the paradigm, this ideology, any ism, realism, naturalism, or say symbolism, these are nothing but different ideologies. These ISM as a suffix in itself reflects the ideology of a certain kind. So realism as a literary genre, and of course we are dealing with literary genre, literary realism, in arts, it underscored the idea of the unembellished, of the unornamented, sans any supernatural elements or elements of speculative fiction. So the main goal of, say, the main artistic goal of these painters and generally the realist movement was the relatable, the reliable depiction of daily motives undertaken via avoiding both the intricate technical details, the conventions, and any appeal to the supernatural or the exotic subject matter, which was somehow passed down from generations to generation from the time of classicism to maybe 17th century neoclassicism to ultimately romanticism, and then coming back to this realism, this present one, literary realism. And come to think of neoclassicism, think of La Pléiade, think of Académie Francoise, where these literary masters, these playwrights, these poets, these creative artists, they had precisely set rules and regulations as to be what needs to be followed in art. And any deviation from these kind of rules and regulations would, of course, be met with a lot of criticism. Think of Pierre Corneille and Jean Racine. Think of, Mallarmé, or of course, think of Baudelaire. The present context of realism, think of Baudelaire, Mallarmé, and so forth. Pierre Corneille, when he deviated from this idea of the rules, the different rules as given by, say, Académie Francoise, he was severely met with a lot of criticism, a lot of these pamphleteering war that took place against Pierre Corneille. And of course, after a long hiatus, when he joined back in writing, he made sure that he had to resort to these rules. So neoclassicism was this much finicky about the following of rules, and that, of course, it was preceded later on by Romanticism, the Age of Enlightenment and its influence, something that somehow affected the psyche and, of course, the role of the creative artist during the Romanticism. So what about this realism? What about its age, the Zeitgeist that we precisely know for, that we precisely look for? Zeitgeist, the spirit of a particular age, of a particular time, and the spirit, something which somehow affects their writing, the writings of their creative masters. So we'll come down to the discussion of the Zeitgeist, but before that, what exactly about this realism? So initial motivations and goals were to depict the subject matter as truthfully as possible, to see everyday, to depict the everyday mundane, quotidian, banal activities, to depict the contemporary recent social life, a detailed description with the help of visual and other sensory details, and of course to give a bit of the psychologically and socially plausible characters, how they were engaged in their everyday quotidian events, their quotidian lives, including people on the margins starting to occupy the center. At least in literature, this started to happen. And of course, the narrative, talking about the literary realism, the narrative of these fictional accounts, will come down to poetry as well. The narratives of these fictional accounts, how they revealed the social life that were normally not known, not confronted, or not represented otherwise in the artistic world. Now, of course, as I said, that it started with 18th century with the French, and French, the hallmark of French realists was they clearly were making a shift from the classical and the romantic ethos that had dominated the figurative arts, including, say, literature in France throughout the 18th century. Now, I was talking about the idea of Zeitgeist, or if you take into account the various elements of Zeitgeist, the socio-political life, the socio-cultural life, the economic life, the religion, the philosophy, the science, the movement, and of course, the progress of science and movement in general. So in philosophy and science, the age of enlightenment, theories of rationalism, empiricism, the very conflict between rationalism and empiricism, Descartes, John Locke, then Comte's positivism, they all somehow contributed to this shift in the ethos, shift in terms of thought, shift in thought towards more a scientific one, towards a rational one, demanding the every man is representing any human being, any man as a denizen of these countries, every man's democratic representation. And how do we know that? Think of French Revolution. And in fact, the very revolutions of 1848, this age of revolution of 1848, where Europe witnessed all across different countries the greater demand for democratic voices in the Republic. And to add to it, there were a lot of these theories by the philosophers of the past and these political thinkers, these generic thinkers who somehow insisted on the very idea of rationality and the very notion of how sensory experience and ability to experience things as it is and to be able to project them in reality and to be able to project them artistically is again equally important. Though a little declamation I would make, we are still not going into the epistemological or the ontological debates about the idea of realism. The depiction of reality, is it really real? What you say as a fictional account of someone else's life or the life of these proletariat, of these working class men, are you really in a position of command to take their agency and depict their lives as it is? Is it really real, right? So this epistemological debates, it remains, and that somehow also formed largely the criticism against the realist novel, against the literary realism, to which we'll come down one by one. So apart from this development in philosophy and science, this age saw a lot of otherwise developments in science, for example, and science and technology in general. For example, the very development of photography, the very development of a central professional journalism, which demanded that accounts should be narrated the way they are, and little of what could have happened should have been included. So the insistence on realism or the realistic aspect of how it was experienced and how well it should be accounted, narrativized on paper in text was somehow it became the clarion call of the time. Now we move ahead, and these were how these philosophers were somehow divided with this very idea of following rationalism or empiricism. We have Descartes, Spinoza, Allen, and Locke, Berkeley on the other side. And literary realism, when we were talking about how was precisely it found its forerunners, some of the precursors of it. In literature, the novelist Honoré de Balzac was the forerunner of the trend. He was almost like a trailblazer of this particular novel. His works particularly were the trailblazer for realist or the literary realism. And his work, La Comédie Humaine, was an extensive commentary on the French society. This should have been italicized. So with Balzac's literary credo of realism, what he meant was, or what initially was his creative impetus? Where lie the motivations? Let's read it. Poetic creation and scientific creation are closely related activities, manifesting the tendency of realists towards taking over scientific methods. The artists of realism use the achievements of contemporary science, that is the science and technology and development during those days, not to forget the philosophy as well, the strictness and precision of the scientific method in order to understand reality. The positivist spirit in science presupposed feelings, contempt towards metaphysics, the cult of the fact, experiment and proof, confidence in science and the progress that it brought, as well as striving to give a scientific form to study social and moral phenomena. Says the positive spirit in science, it presupposed feeling of contempt towards metaphysics. So no more lurking behind or harking behind the very idea of transcendentalism. Can we really see some of these spirits, these characters, these supernatural beings intervening in their everyday acts of the high and mighty character? Right? So this was something which started to get discarded. The more science involved, the more science and technology saw itself on its growth and on its development, the better the rationality of the human being. And of course, to be very pragmatically approach things life experience started to evolve in the time. So the ethos somehow started to shift from being romantically inclined to nature, romantically inclined to the idea of superpower or nature having some sort of force which can bestow these graces, to the ability of man himself and to govern by these principles, right? Now, how far the environment or these governing principles of nature are affecting the man, this would be something we'll taken up in naturalism, the second literary trend that we'll discuss in detail. So next, La Realme, a critical theoretical manifesto by Champollion. Champollion was although this work did not make itself quite an important one, but of the times, of the age, this was very much of a seminal work. Think of Aristotle's Poetics. Think of how, when it came to selecting certain characters, he emphasized that men of extraordinary valor and bravery and merit should be the subject matter of tragedy. And this is where even Champollion is giving out, through this theoretical manifesto, talking about the range of issues as to what should constitute ideally the character of realist novel, how they should move ahead, what exactly should be the subject matter at the level of, or at the part of the author in terms of what to select and what to discriminately omit. Then Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary, although Champollion was quite critical of Madame Bovary's this novel's ability to deal with criticism, because realism, because he had certain theoretical propositions as to this particularly constitute literary realism, and that is why Madame Bovary did not really fit into these paradigms, these frameworks well, and that is why Champollion's work may not be seen as quite a forerunner or a precursor to the analysis of literary realism, but certainly any idea, any study of literary realism cannot skip probably this critical manifesto as well. So next we have these works. They reinforce the detachment, the objectivity, the accurate observation, a clear but controlled critique of the society. So as a keynote to the 1848, if I precisely take down the dates, 1848 to 1871 period, as a keynote to it, realism, literary realism, its underlying philosophy had been to emphasize the objective reality based on the everyday quotidian activities, something which is ontologically independent of man's conceptual schemes or nature intervening in its own act. But at the same time, when the author is dealing with it, the linguistic practices, the beliefs of it should be known to the artist in such a manner that they use these linguistic practices, they use these tools, figurative tools, linguistic tools that come handy to any artist in a manner to depict reality faithfully. So understanding the length and breadth of this drift as in a drift from the earlier times, the Romanticism, realism is not just about character and environment. Realism in fiction is quite a vexed concept, but it can be defined as an attempt to use linguistic and narrative conventions to create a fictional illusion of social and psychological reality that seems plausible to ordinary readers. Most contemporary realists recognize that language does not so much mirror reality as use conventions to construct a simulacra of what readers can accept as reality. So the very concept of verisimilitude, to be able to project reality in its most similar form, in its more real form. Then we move ahead. Other novelists of the age could be included Charles Dickens, the society that Charles Dickens was talking about. So it's not just that, as I said, as I mentioned earlier, that these ages, and of course these, especially the literary trends, and to be precisely, if I take into account all of these literary trends, they cannot have a very clear-cut demarcation, or we cannot just simply pigeonhole them into a particular country or onto a particular cultural setting. You will find realism or some hints of realism in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, as long as it is able to depict an iota of the different characters on the class spectrum, on the social and class spectrum. But of course, since we are taking into account the time period of 1848 to 1871, the very recent one had been, say, Charles Dickens, Anthony Trollope, George Eliot in England. All of them somehow, of course, they were depicting the zeitgeist of the time, that is the context of the time, and at the same time, they were emphasizing the idea of detachment. They somehow, the novels did reflect the idea of objectivity. There was this accurate observation into which the characters were moving, and the way they were very lucidly presenting them, at the same time, very constructive and restrained in their criticism of the society, right? But all of them somehow insisted on that very humane understanding that underlie the moral judgment of the artist, of the novelist, of the creative artist. And in Russia, we have these figures: Ivan Turner, Leo Tolstoy, Fyodor Dostoevsky. In the United States, we had William Dean Howells, Rebecca Harding, Henry James, sorry, this is wrongly written, Mark Twain. In Germany, Gottfried Keller, and the earlier writings of Thomas Mann. Now, in theatre, it was again a clear shift from the tradition of melodrama, the melodramatic performances, which were too much taking into account the elements of choral songs, the orchestra, the song and dance sequences, and absolute emphasis on the spectacle component of how the particular performance is to be made. And this shift from melodramatic performance to realistic ones, we find that Anthony Chekhov from Russia, then Maxim Gorky in Russia was writing and projecting very appropriately. Then say we had Henrik Ibsen in Scandinavia, and then August Strindberg, and then taking into account the other, say in Spain as well, we had a lot of these. Spain, in fact, has witnessed very recently, 15th century, it has witnessed the golden age of drama, and the prolific Spanish drama is well known for its ability to produce these almost tens and thousands of these creative texts, dramatic texts, which still date they somehow have remained undiscovered. And the researchers are very much involved into discovering the Spanish drama. So the idea is that all in all, realism, literary realism, saw its flowering not just in particular one genre. It was spreading across in different kinds of genre, and these creative artists, these novelists, these writers, these poets were readily embracing this idea of realism, to be able to depict reality and its mundaneness in its inclusivity. And of course, the other aspects of the industrial realism and the ugly side of what industrial revolution left, or the ugly side of what French Revolution was left behind. This was something it found its echo in the literary writings of these creative artists. And apart from it, there had been other offshoot of realism as well. There is social realism, there is psychological realism, there is naturalism, socialist realism, magic realism, kitchen sink realism, all of them. Somehow I felt that individually they would require, if you would ask them to create a discourse, each one of them could be around 2 to 3 years in terms of what socialist realism had been. Although much later to this century, we witnessed this post the birth of, say, Stalin and the way communists were demanding for a kind of socialist ability to depict them in literature as well. As I've mentioned on the screen, social realism, these were some of the examples. Then Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, a social novel about class and politics in France. Kitchen sink realism, John Brain was writing, although this was again post 1900 and post World War, we see that this kind of kitchen sink realism. And of course, with kitchen sink realism, a lot of these avant-garde movements were taking place. The symbolism, impressionism, and expressionism of it, a lot of these avant-gardist way of moving beyond the idea of realism was certainly taking place, which for the present kind of lecture, we're not taking into consideration, but this came much later, 1957. Socialist realism, cement, this particular word, cement by Fyodor Glader, a type of realism created by Joseph Stalin and adopted by communists. Naturalism, Emile Zola, of course, naturalism because we are going to deal with it in detail. That is why much of information is here. Psychological realism, Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky from Russia. Now, criticism. Thinking of what could be the reasons why this particular literary form, in its ability to cater to the masses and to be able to create such a popularity in its depiction, how can this very literary, say, trend go out of current? The reason is many realist novels do seem to convey an actualist view of reality, but they were mainly concerned with the thingness, the material reality of the world. And other such allegations against literary realism had been, such art was seen to invite judgments based upon correspondence theory of truth. It demanded recognition of its exhausted verisimilitude. What does this mean? Simply, there was this demand for, and by this time we see a lot of these theories on epistemology, the very science of knowledge, it started to emerge. So what we call truth may not be a clear reality in itself. So what we called truth as to be the physical property of an object may not be the reality of it. So it somewhere has to do with how I perceive my own sensory experiences with that particular object matter. And when I perceive these sense objects, then certainly its physical properties might move as unimportant and not so crucial for me, because how I perceive this particular object and the kind of difference it makes to my reality, my experience, kind of delineates from the actual object and its functions. So this is where realism faced a lot of literary realism faced a lot of criticism onto its very idea of the epistemology of reality, created questions as to whether it is really real or not. Then Roland Barthes, he dismissed such representative platitudes as a reality effect. That means by which the writer imposes the illusion that art offers, something which he claims, the writer claims, as to be an unmediated access to a real world. So both self-identity and knowledge acquisition, they were represented as inherently individualistic rather than social. Now, come to think of the very notion of these proletariat, these people on the margins, and making them as subject matter, the life of these working class people, then their self-identity, their ability to acquire knowledge, make sense of their surroundings, of their environment, was something individualistic. And how the author sees them as to pick up their experience again is individualistic, is quite preferential rather than social. So this critique of the novel's complicity with Enlightenment ideologies has transformed critical understanding of literary realism. And that's how later on you'll find that thanks to the limitation of this kind of literary trend, the new movements of symbolism, the idea of stream of consciousness, the idea to depict the labyrinths and the workings of the mind, which probably deserve equal importance, rather than just focusing on outside of it, it came into being. The point of, okay, the epistemological and ontological understanding of the realist tradition is always in question. Next, this is the concluding thoughts on this idea of that very suspicion over its epistemology or its epistemological position would be, it can be stated, realist novels typically utilized a mixture of empirical actualism, that is, something which is known out there, which exists in reality as a matter of fact, and universalizing idealism. If the world of the fiction insists upon the intractable nature of actuality, these central protagonists frequently underwrite the ultimate freedom of the soul. Notably, as the anxiety about mass society perceived by the educated classes in terms of brutish bodies increased during the later decades, then the novelist's concern came to focus largely upon interiority. This is where the very notion of how there is a need to not just depict reality in its external or exteriority of things, also there is a demand to move beyond that. That is, moving in the interior zones of the mind, the interior recesses of the heart and the mind, and to explore these labyrinths of the head, of the mind, of the brain, and so forth. So this is what somehow it was shifting towards. A character's capacity for subjective self-scrutiny, which always is there, which somehow gets omitted in a realist novel. Their moral discriminations and spiritual development became the most important index of their work and of the writer's artistic refinement. Those characters lacking spiritual sensibility are often depicted. So very clear-cut demarcation of if a character saw himself moving towards materialism or acquiring more wealth and so on and so forth, clearly would be say compartmentalized into one form, or there would be this neat pigeonholing that will take place into a character being materialistic, a character being too much spiritual. So this gray zones, the gray matters needs to be discovered as well, and they were almost demanding its way out, its kind of way out in the expression of arts and literature. And that is why later we find almost a century, next century, with the beginning of 1900, say 1910, 1920s, we find that the movement, the aesthetic movement of symbolism, impressionism, surrealism, and the avant-gardist movement, they started to evolve. Of course, the zeitgeist is equally important, but the shift in the literary ethos, that's how the trends start making a movement out of it.